Hi, this is Gianmarc Manzione for ActionBowlers.com. I'm thrilled to be working with AC Butch on our audio narrative of action bowling history. And to get things started, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and how I came to fall in love with the amazing stories of action bowling's colorful past. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and by the time I got into bowling there, I started to hear stories about the legends that still lingered in bowling alleys all over the area. Names like Johnny Petraglia, Richie Hornreich, and Mark Roth would get tossed around now and then, and I could tell from the looks in the eyes of people who talked about them that there was a lot more to these guys than a name. In pro shops around town, I would see memorabilia like bowling balls with Mark Roth's signature on them, and I would stand and stare at it as if I had just discovered the signature of God. I was just in awe, and I didn't even entirely know why back then. I was just a kid, but I just had this nagging impression that something very big had happened there long before I came around, and the more time went on, the more I wanted to know about it. So later on, bowling took a back seat to a love of reading and writing, but my love of the game stayed with me, and one day it occurred to me that I could combine these two passions by going back and finding the guys I used to hear stories about back when I was a kid, and telling their tales. So in 2009, I embarked on a furious search for as many of these legends as I could track down. Thanks to rumors of their whereabouts on ActionBowlers.com and the white pages, I was able to find these guys all over the place. I found and spoke with Dewey Blair by calling the bowling alley where he still bowled league. I met and struck up a friendship with Ernie Schlegel, and he put me in touch with guys like Mike Lemongello and Kenny Barber, both of whom I interviewed for several hours. I interviewed Johnny Petraglia, and later I tracked down Richie Hornreich in Bensonhurst, a working-class Italian section of Brooklyn where I was born, and listened to his amazing stories over the phone. Later I spoke with guys like Mike McGrath, Barry Asher, the list goes on and on. Then I found Jeff Kidder out in South Carolina. I had seen something on ActionBowlers.com about how he was living out there, so I looked him up in the white pages and I called, and to my astonishment, Jeff answered the phone and he was really generous with his time. I interviewed him for several hours as well. You can find my story about Jeff on ActionBowlers.com, actually. It's called Memory Lane, Back in Central with Jeff Kidder. When I lived in Tampa, Florida, I made the trip down to Larry Lichstein's pro shop in Cape Coral, and I listened to his stories for hours as well. I just sat there and listened in complete awe of Larry. What a character. And I also tracked down lesser-known guys who played bit roles in the scene but who have amazing stories to tell. So now I'm working on a book that will have many action bowling stories in it. I've been slaving over it for several years, and my ardent hope is that somehow I'll be able to tell these stories well enough for them to appeal to a mainstream publisher who can help this stuff get the attention it so richly deserves, because I think that's the least I can do to preserve these memories. And that's basically it. I'm just a kid from Brooklyn who grew up in the distant aftermath of action bowling history and took up the challenge of piecing that history together again as much as I could. I hope you enjoy the stories Butch and I have to share with you. The first time Ernie Schlegel and his posse stepped inside Jimmy Dike's lanes in Philly looking for action, the name of the place itself should have been their first clue about the kind of night they were in for. A famed ballplayer turned manager for the Philadelphia Athletics, Dykes was a hard-scrabble Philly kid whose wrists grew as strong as a bull's legs from working as a pipe fitter, and he spewed such venom at umpires over balls and strikes as a manager that he got tossed for more than 60 games and either fined or suspended 37 times. But on this particular night, it wasn't just the streets of Philly and their assorted characters that Ernie and the boys faced. It was also a part of town down at the end of Route 9 in South Jersey that they knew better than to visit again by the time the night was through. They knew better than to do a lot of things by then. They knew to call it quits when they were ahead. They knew not to take small-time bets from gamblers who'll mug you at knife point if they lose. And they knew that you only humiliate a man in his own house if you have enough guns to make it out alive. Such are the lessons you learn late at night in the bowling alleys of Philly and South Jersey, places Ernie prowled in the back of Toru Nagai's slick black caddy with his enterprising sidekick, Steve Harris, in tow. Nagai, a diminutive Japanese restaurateur who ran a sandwich shop near Columbia University, chauffeured Ernie to big-money matches out of state on weekends like a horse breeder cashing in on his prized pony. Harris was a streetwise Jewish kid with horn-rimmed glasses who grew up on the same tough streets as Ernie and never turned down a chance to bet on his buddy whenever Ernie hit the lanes. And all signals suggested that a big money match was precisely the thing Philly had in store on this particular night. I remember saying this because when I thought about it later on, it sounded so corny, Harris remembers years later. I called up Ernie and I said, "Ernie, we got a fish in Philadelphia." A fish, in action bowling parlance, is a sucker whose money is easy because he either doesn't know his competition or he has an exaggerated sense of his own abilities. You do whatever it takes to get him on the lanes and make his money yours. That's the bottom line. No matter where the scent of that fish happened to lead, Ernie Schlegel followed it the way a coyote follows the trail of a dying animal. From Queens to Connecticut, from Paramus to Pennsylvania, no destination was too far off if it promised to bring in the cash. Toro Nagai in his Cadillac made sure of that. Toro was older than us, Harris recalls. He was about 35 and we were barely in our 20s, and the fact that he had a Cadillac was amazing because he had a car, and we certainly didn't. On this particular night, Ernie found this fish in the form of a hotshot down in Philly who said he would bowl anybody who dared to show up at his home alley. Harris did the man the favor of informing him that a fellow by the name of Ernie Schlegel would be quite happy to oblige his offer, but that before agreeing to bowl him, he might want to consider the very real possibility that Ernie would hand him his ass and charge him for it. Harris could talk that way by then. He had just watched the guy challenge his buddy Richie Solomon to $25 a game and bowl him to an even draw after several hours. A bowler of Schlegel's caliber, this was not. If the man could not get the best of Richie Solomon after 3 hours of trying his damnedest to do so, then he sure as hell would not get the best of Ernie Schlegel. I told him, "You've got to be kidding me, you're not that good," Steve Harris recalls. We'd been there for several hours, and I felt comfortable being honest with him. And he says, "I'm telling you, I will bowl anybody." So I asked him if he would be willing to bowl my friend Ernie Schlegel, and he said, "I will bowl anybody." I told him, "Well, he's really good. I mean, he's much better than you." He says, "I will bowl him." And I just said, "Well, all right." I told him my friend Ernie is willing to bowl him, and that we will come down next weekend. And come next weekend, they did. Pulling up to the joint in style, with Nagai's jet black caddy, and 4 games later, counting the large bills of Ernie's easy victory over the tough-talking local. Ernie thrashed the man for 4 straight games to bank $200, and that, in hindsight, is where his exploits down at Philly that night ought to have ended. But when you've got your eye on that bottom line, and it's yielding just enough cash to pick your hunger for more, it's awfully easy to talk about what should have been. Here in Philly, the money flowed like beer from a tap, and home was more than 2 hours up the road. You don't just drive from New York to Philly to bowl 4 games and leave. So Ernie made about $200. Not tremendous, but not bad, Harris remembers. And now we think, oh, now we got to get out of here and they don't do anything to us, because in those days, you thought that way. But we get to the door, and instead of saying something nasty, the guy comes over. He shakes our hands, and he says, "It was a pleasure bowling you guys." And he said, "If you really want to make some money, there's a bowling alley out on Route 9 in New Jersey called Federal Lanes. And the manager there will bowl anybody for any amount. He's like a superstar in that bowling alley. But you're better than him, and you can take him. So why don't you go down there?" Call it the voice of greed. Call it the voice of the devil himself. But whatever force compelled the man to lure them down Route 9 that night, Ernie and the boys heard it loud and clear. Down Route 9 they went in the pitch darkness of night. They went in pursuit of the next fish, but what they would find instead are the kind of people who only come out at night, the ones who'll just as soon slit your throat as shake your hand. We drive down Route 9 looking for the place, and we find it, Harris says. Now it's about 1 a.m., and the guy's getting ready to close up. We walk in and ask him if he'd like to bowl. We heard he liked action, and he said sure, and we started bowling. And that, as Ernie and the boys were about to learn, was their first mistake. Once again, the guy's prized pony performed well enough to recoup every dime of gas money he made to take him there and then some, besting the superstar for hours on end until the first glow of dawn blanched the bowling alley windows. They bowled for a long time, and Ernie again was better than him, but the guy was good, Harris says. Now it's probably about 5 or 6 in the morning and we're exhausted. We've been out since the afternoon, and I remember sitting in the settee area behind another pair of lanes and sort of falling half asleep when in come these kids, about 16 or 17 years old, and they want to bet on their guy, the manager, and Ernie decides he'll keep bowling. I said, look, I'll cover whatever you guys have. And they start putting up $7 here, $3 there. We weren't used to that, because at the places back home, they don't bet that small. But there were at least 8 of these kids, and between them and what the manager was betting, it was still an okay bet. Still an okay bet. After 24 hours of shutting the biggest mouths and bowling alleys from Philly to South Jersey without so much as a minute's sleep in the meantime, all it took was an okay bet to rouse Steve Harris from his half-conscious slumber. Ernie laced up his shoes again. Harris tallied all the money the kids dared to spare on a man who had no answer for Ernie Schlegel. The machine set yet another rack of pins, and the games, once again, began. By now that superstar Steve and Ernie heard about back at Jimmy Dykes Lanes looked like little more than a super sucker, and his next few games did nothing to demonstrate otherwise. So Ernie beats him another few games in a row, Harris says, and at that point, it's over. Or so Harris thought. The bowlers Harris knew back home might take a bad night of losses in stride and try their luck again the following night. But the boys Harris did business with down in Jersey were the kind that didn't wait until next time to get their money back. No, these were the kind of gamblers who only lost when they agreed to, who only went home with empty pockets if the other guys brought bigger knives than they did. Ernie packed his ball and shoes again. Harris slipped back into the half-conscious sleep he'd fallen into before this pack of kids came looking to score. And that is when the night they would never forget got started. Harris heard the sound of kids slamming bowling balls into the floor and damning to hell the, quote, New York hustlers Toru had brought to town. Harris, only feigning sleep now, listened as the kids openly discussed what speed and trajectory a bowling ball must be thrown to blow open a grown man's head like a pumpkin at a shooting range. And that, of course, was the end even of the pretense of sleep. That, perhaps, was the moment Harris found himself more awake than ever before. A realization that the next time you do catch some sleep may in fact be the last time will tend to do that to you. Finally, I stood up and took a couple steps toward them, Harris says, and I just said, what's your problem? They started again with the "You're New York hustlers," and I said, look, we're not hustlers. We didn't come in here pretending we didn't know how to bowl, asking if you'll teach us how to bowl like they do in a pool hall. We came in and Ernie said, do you want to bowl? That means he's good. We know the manager's good and Ernie's good. That's not hustling. Ernie beat him fair and square. Mere reason may have been enough to get them out of jams back in New York City, but down in South Jersey, Harris would find that reason's no match for a knife. Well, the shortest one walks up to me and he takes out this thing. I don't know what it was. It looked like a switchblade knife, Harris remembers. But instead of a switchblade knife, which was popular in those days among certain elements, this thing was like a box cutter because when you pushed the button, the blade came straight out and it was half an inch wide like a razor blade. And he actually pushed it in my stomach and he said to me, "You're gonna die." Just like that. And with that, I did not say another word. I was stone cold sober at that point. And then he looked at me and said, "Are you a Jew?" And I thought, oh my God, my whole life passed before me. For some reason, my first inclination was to say no. But my second inclination was to be truthful. And I said, yes, I am. What about it? And the guy takes the blade away and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, me too, give me 5. I couldn't believe it. He put his hand out and I slapped him 5 and I said to him, "What's wrong?" And he said, "We don't have enough money for breakfast." If enough dough to buy breakfast was all it would take to spare Steve Harris's life, then breakfast was precisely what these boys would get. Harris learned enough on the streets of New York City to know a can't-miss deal when he saw one. He promptly curled off $30 from his roll of the night's winnings, easily enough in those days, the 1960s, to buy breakfast every day for the next week. And, just as quickly, he and Ernie followed Toru out of the place, making sure to offer a few kind goodbyes on their way out, for good measure. I never worried when I was with Toru, Ernie says years later. One of Toru's buddies was 5'1", 108 pounds, and one time he's walking up the block in New York, and these three huge dudes stopped him. They wanted his money. So he told them, look, I have $8. I will give each of you $2. I need the other two to get home. But they wanted all his money. And in 3 seconds, the biggest guy of the three was out cold, and the other two guys ran like crazy. Toru was like that. And that's the Toru Nagai whom the Breakfast Club Harris brought off with $30 was about to meet. The one whose size disguised the killer within. The $30 Harris peeled off to silence them only kept them at the bowling alley lunch counter for long enough to see him follow Ernie and Toru into the parking lot. But that money did something else. It suggested to the hoods that a knife is all it takes to bleed cash out of Harris, like a burglar using someone's stolen code at an ATM machine. We say goodbye to the manager, and the guys are at the counter having breakfast, and all of a sudden, one of them jumps up, and he gets on the payphone, and I hear him saying, "Let's get these guys," Harris says. Just as Harris and Ernie made it to Toru's car in the parking lot, they found themselves confronted by the whole gang they thought they'd bought off inside, and now they were armed to the teeth with chains, knives, pipes. But the only weapons Toru Nagai needed were his own bare hands, and that is all he needed to make it home alive on this particular night, too. When you lose, that should be a lesson to you, Nagai admonished with a scowl, performing a brutal karate chop on the fender of another parked car. Then Toru said, "Let's get the hell out of here," Ernie recalls, "because, if we scared them, they might get more people. So we just got the hell out of there." Toru twisted the keys in the ignition of his caddy and, as he peeled off into the street, lifted a long iron bar from under his seat and twirled it around in his hand. From their vantage point, the gangsters swore he was wielding a gun. If the objective was not to scare the poor bastards, then at that point, they could consider the night a total failure, because fear attracted the hoods like moths to a porch light. "They must have thought it was a gun, and they scattered like you wouldn't believe," Harris says. "But when we got out on a Route 9 to head home, they chased us for a good half an hour, about 30 to 35 miles, and we were going top speed, about 80 miles an hour. But suddenly, they just abruptly turned around, and that was the end of them. But we made a couple $100, and I never forgot it, obviously, because I really thought that kid was going to kill me. And that was the last I ever saw of Federal Lanes."